This is the Voice of Russia from London. Hello, I'm Tim Eckott, and you're listening to In Conversation. My guest this time is the writer Edna OBrien. She's been called the doyenne of Irish literature, with around 20 novels, numerous plays, screenplays and poetry anthologies to her name. She came to prominence in 1960 with her novel The Country Girls, which was regarded as scandalous in Ireland and was both banned and publicly burned. O'Brien has now written a memoir entitled Country Girl, in which she describes her Irish childhood, her unhappy marriage to an older man, and her life in London in the swinging 60s. She said many times she'd never write a memoir, so I wondered what had prompted her to do it now.
What prompted me, I think, was age. I was in my 78th year when I began it, which is 3.5 years ago, to be precise. And it occurred to me one day, I was with my agent, that many people have written about me and have assumed a narrative of my life which is not accurate, which is not my life. And I thought, only I know, not just the facts of my life, they can be researched, but only I know the impact that the narrative of my life has had on me. Only I know what I feel. A journalist, either well-intentioned or maliciously intentioned, can impose an idea. And I felt that I had been, in some quarters, regarded as, forgive the word, somewhat glamorous, and had led this Mata Hari-type life, which is far from the truth.
A lot of that, a lot of that probably stems from the fact that your first novel was very much about your Irish background and your Irish upbringing, but it had what were then regarded as rather scandalous elements, and you published it when you were living in England, so you were a little bit of you'd become a bit of a traitor in a way, just in some people's eyes.
I've become definitely a bit of a rebel, shall we call it, and indeed, when I did write my first book, The Country Girls, it's almost laughable now when you think about it, Tim. It was banned, and 6 of my books were banned, in fact, and it had its little pathetic provincial or parochial burning in the chapel grounds in where I come from, a beautiful but backward place. There'd be no tradition of writing, and far more importantly, there'd be no tradition of a woman writing. So the fact that I was a woman and wrote what seemed to be in a confidential tone of voice, what seemed to be not so much a novel as just telling, as fact. People took that very personally, and they felt that I had either mocked or, more importantly, humiliated or betrayed them. In those days, the Catholic Church in Ireland was vigilant to the point of unbelievably so. So I personally, if you like, had betrayed them, even though that was not what I thought The Country Girls, and I still think it's a little elegy to my own land, because I love my own land. And The Country Girls, I don't have it here, but I'll tell you the first 3 or 4 lines, or I'll tell our listeners. I wakened quickly and sat up in bed abruptly. It is only when I am anxious that I waken easily. And for a minute I could not remember, then I did, the old reason. My father, he had not come home. Now, anyone reading that will see that its content is going to be about attachment. Attachment to family, to place, to heritage, to everything. But within the attachment, there is some trouble.
Let's go back to the substance of Country Girl, your memoir. The biographical detail in your first novel caused you a lot of trouble within your family and within Ireland. Yeah. Of course, memoir has its pitfalls as well. People will often say people will write a memoir to gloss over some of the things and to put their own version out there. Yes. And they're often, people who write memoirs are often accused of fictionalizing their own lives. Has that happened to you?
Yeah, well, actually, it's a very interesting thing to talk about. Again, a small digression for a second, Teb, relating to it. I pick as one of my favorite, the memoirs that I read, I pick Vladimir Nabokov's Speak Memory. His memoir is beautiful, but he tells very little. It tells very little of what really mattered. He avoided that. He didn't want that. He wrote a beautiful memoir, and I am glad to have read it and to have reread it. But he literally opened the outer door of the cupboard of his psyche. All the skeletons, all else, which he deliberately and intentionally, he did not touch on them. That's fine. It is not a lie, it's a selection. He selected what he wanted to say, which indeed any memoirist must. In my own case, I think I have been true and in some way nakedly true to the things that happened to me. I did not want to do what he did. Why should I? I'm a different person. I'm a woman. I'm from Ireland. And I don't have the sheath of self-preservation. I wanted to tell what I felt most deeply about each and every chapter in my life. I believe, and I know this sounds a little bit maybe fanciful, I believe that I was present for my birth, not just delivered by a midwife with some commotion in a cold room in December upstairs, but something, the word I'm going to use, something permeable was there. Now, other people will say this is opinionated, this is foolish, but it's not foolish if I feel it. And therefore, why my memoir was painful for me to write, I know you didn't ask me that, but I'll mention it, and in another sense, releasing for me to write, was to not just to retrace, but to re-immerse myself when being bitten by a dog, a mad dog, biting first the dress and then into the flesh, being that child of 4 with that dog, etc. It was understandably easier writing the childhood parts, because first of all, any writer, and you're a writer, knows that the childhood impressions, both of landscape, of politics, of history, of governing, of exile, whatever it be, is embedded in one. To say it's indented isn't enough, it's embedded. Where I had greater difficulty in writing was in the later chapters, not the very late ones, but along the way. And one I single out, and you may want to ask me about any other, is the chapter of the war in the north of Ireland, the 30-year dirty war, as they called it. And I went to the north of Ireland many times, went to visit people in prisons, and I am an Irish woman, a sort of wayward Catholic, I would call myself, and naturally my sympathies were with Catholics. My sympathy was not in every piece of carnage, whether it was done by the IRA or the 4 Protestant paramilitaries and British Army and B Specials. So there was one side, and there were 5 together on the opposite side. And just as an observing human being, I felt down the years that the deeds and misdeeds of the IRA were far more reported and far more criticised and far more hated, especially in Ireland, in England and in Ireland, than the same or similar butchery, carnage, ill deeds on the other side. I thought that is wrong. History has to be reported fairly. But in the writing of the chapter in the North, I think it took me about 4 months to write that chapter alone, and it was about 100 pages and then shortened down to about 20 pages.
Edna, can I just stop you there and ask you, would you mind reading a short passage there from your memoir about Ireland?
It was borne in on me at that very young age that I came from fierce people, and that the wounds of history were very raw and vivid as the pictures on the packs of cards that had been flung down in temper. The north of Ireland was an area on a map, and yet the way they harangued, losing their reason and hurling accusations at each other, I knew that one day it would darken our lives. I knew that chapter and the chapter on love, that old chestnut, would be the two hardest for me to write. I'm not interested in memoirs who just tell you they met so-and-so, who give you a list of names. Give a list of names. I have had love affairs, not as many, unfortunately, as I'm reputed to have, but I did not want to write a gossip book naming those people. I said, what does it matter if one describes the intensity of a love affair without naming the protagonist? What does it matter? But to a gossip-obsessed world, it does matter. And in the book, and I hope now I'll be able to pronounce her name right, I told you when we met outside that I revere Russian writers. I am the greatest admirer of Russian writers I wish to claim in the world. And I reread. But the poet Marina Tsvetaeva, I felt that my way of loving, which was not a wise one, had more in common with dear Maria's than with anyone else I knew, Irish or any other. And I mentioned this. Maria, for instance, in love with Rilke, whom she never met, endeavouring to meet Rilke, not having the money even to take a train to the next town, let alone to meet Rilke. I suppose it's a writer's disposition, if not to say crime, building up a whole world, in Maria's case, and probably in my case, although it wasn't Rilke, alas, building up a world that was based on a fantasy. So in the memoir, I wrote about love because I often write about love, but I did not satisfy some more prurient need.
Well, can we talk about that? Because I think you write about one or two love affairs, as you say, without going into very much detail about who the men were.
Yes.
You also write very openly about your quite unhappy marriage.
Yes.
And the heartache of the separation from your children, very movingly. Without going into forensic detail, you convey the darkness of that period.
Yes.
You convey the passion of the love affairs, even though you don't go into much detail.
Yes.
But you do also keep the gossipers happy a little bit, don't you? Because you've got a list of, I mean, anybody who was anybody in the 60s, when you were in London at the height of your fame, perhaps, in that very revolutionary social period, you know, you were going out with Marlon Brando. You do admit to, well, shall we say, you crossed paths with a lot of the big names in Hollywood. And you do mention that you had a brief romantic affair with Robert Mitchum.
Robert Mitchum. Who wouldn't? What woman wouldn't? I saw Robert Mitchum in the movies. There was an old film shown the night before last. And I thought, yes, I remember that face. There was something about Robert Mitchum not more than all actors, but as an actor, there was something. He was as much a street poet as an actor. He wasn't ostensibly vain. But I was lucky in a period. I'll just talk about my husband and then the giddy season, as I call it. I was married to a man older than me by 20 years. He was Czech, German, Jewish. I was never quite sure. I don't think he was quite sure what race he fully was, but he had an Irish mother. And he was a very, very authoritative figure. And I was 20 and he was 40 when we met, and I did, in full novelistic Victorian fashion, elope with him. It was fiction from the start, this eloping and going to live in a large country house in Ireland where there was the ghost, for me, the living ghost of a previous wife. You know, it had elements of fiction. I found I had, for the first time in my life, leisure. I found I had time on my hands out there in the wilds of County Wicklow, and I began to read. And as I began to read, I began to write. I wrote little frothy pieces for newspapers, most of which were rejected. But I got time to read. I was reading Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway and Moby Dick. I was always reading the Russians, so let me not omit that. And from the moment I began to write, I could see that my husband, who was a writer, began to fear that there was more to me than just this literary flibberty-gibbet. So I began to write, and that began to put a chink in the marriage, because my husband was also a writer. And then I was married for 10 years and had 2 children. But as the fabric of the marriage began to fray more and more, I became more attached to my writing. My writing, that was going to be my escape route of the marriage.
And very clearly, very dramatically, your husband read the manuscript and said, you can write and I'll never forgive you.
I will never forgive you.
And that was really, in the memoir, that is the symbolic moment when the marriage is clearly dead.
Somebody said they didn't believe that moment, but in fact it's a true moment. You couldn't make up a moment as good as that, frankly. So I left my husband after 10 years of marriage, and I'd written 2 novels, The Country Girls and The Lonely Girl. The third is Girls in Their Married Bliss, which I wrote soon after leaving him, which is of a different and more abrasive, less lyrical tone of voice. So I left him with no money, but I still began, I was writing, didn't have custody of my children, going on a bus to their school to see them, and they'd be crying and I would be upset. And anyhow, it was a very hard 4 years of trying to get custody. But now comes the part you asked me about. I worked very hard always, all my life, still working very hard. In short, I got a bit of money. Not a lot of money, but a bit to get a little house. And then I got more money to get a bigger house. And then began the era of the parties. It was only about 18 months, I think, of my life. But because the parties were every Saturday, rather like football match, they were a steady. People could come, and people brought other people. And it's true. I would look up, and through the door I would see another Lee Marvin or Judy Garland or somebody arriving, having been brought by a producer that I met, who asked me to write a screenplay of Mary McCarthy's book, The Group. So I got the name and the reputation for these very exciting parties, Roger Vadim and Jane Fonda with their R.D. Lang, the psychiatrist, and indeed Marlon Brando came not to a party, but privately. I had met him in Leslie Caron's, and he had his driver drive me home and insisted on coming in. And he was indeed a magic isn't the right word. He was a magnetic person. Nothing he did was not arresting. Everything about him, his whole body, his animal-like body, hands, face, eyes, everything he did, you saw, you noticed, you could not. He was also a charmer and full of stories, and I love stories.
But you didn't fall for him?
I didn't fall for him because I loved talking to him. I've said in my memoir, which my agent, Ed Victor, loves, I said there are 2 types of men for me. There are the brother figures, Richard Burton or Marlon Brando or whoever, who can beguile one with stories, and I feel totally at ease with and enchanted by. It's like the magic garden. And there are others who are more formidable, if not to say unattainable, and those few are the ones I fell in love with.
You said that Robert Mitchum was something of a poet, but he's not necessarily someone watching him on screen you would think would be someone you would have a conversation with. Was he someone you could talk to, or did that not matter? Oh,
no, he was both, funnily enough. Mitchum broke the 2 rules I've just mentioned earlier. Yeah, he was full of conversation, and chain gang that he was on, drugs that he took, and he was very dismissive of Hollywood. He thought acting was really a mug's game. No, he was certainly a talkative, wild, and someone who had so much, I felt, going on inside him, in his psyche. So much turbulence and wildness and happiness and talent that you'd wonder if he got a sound sleep at night.
Somebody reviewing your book has written, as a Celt, O'Brien holds a secret communion with the mystery of things. Irishness Do you believe there is something special about the Irish, the way they talk about the world, compared to the English?
I definitely do. It's neither said in glory or in bravura. I can't explain it, unfortunately, because it's beyond language. I feel that my attachment and more than my memory, my recall of the place I was bred and born in, of the people I came from, of that land, of those bog roads, of those mounds that we are told have battles or the relics of time in them, more than the relics, the blood of time in them. The actual landscape itself, trees and everything all around our house, they weren't in a nice, neat row like an English country house. They were more that they had also an animus. I know it to be true without being able to put it into words, but I'm also very glad of it because it adds to the pot. Writing needs that as well as the more obvious things.
You led a life of exile in England. Was
Yes.
that a terrible spiritual loss for you not to be around Irish people, even though in a way they'd rejected you by their provinciality?
No, not a terrible loss at all, because the Ireland I know is inside my head. It's just there inside me, the way I feel about things, the way I think about things, whether I'm in Ireland or in England, doesn't matter. And of course, there is a very important thing to remember, which is, although the Irish use the English language differently, the actual language is the same. So, although I've lived in exile...
Some would say they use it better.
Well, James Joyce certainly used it better, and so did Samuel Beckett. They certainly use it with more rapture. They use it with more appetite for the language itself. I feel Irish people do. But there's also the thing about exile that's important for me to say to you, which is I can go back any time. If I couldn't go back, if I were banished, as Ovid was, banished from returning to my own bit of my own country, that would break my heart, and it would probably break my writing spell.
You had to read a lot of memoir. You've mentioned Nabokov, but you've also written and been quite vocal at other times about the influence Chekhov had on your own writing.
Yes. Chekhov is what I say. Shakespeare, in my opinion, is the greatest writer that I have ever read. But the writer that I love most, that I reread most, unfortunately in translation, many different translations, and that I feel has befriended me in my life in times of pain, in times of separation, in times of doubt, in times of everything, is Chekhov. Chekhov understood human nature more than any other writer I know. His work is like nature itself. It's like air or rain. It is flawless and uncontradictable in its depiction of humankind. Now, Joseph Brodsky didn't think that, and I like Joseph Brodsky, but we disagreed about Chekhov. Why Chekhov matters, and I wish more young people, I feel messianic about it, I wish more young people would read Chekhov. They sometimes see second-rate productions of his plays. His plays are very hard to do because they're ineffable. As I say, like Raina, they can be done very well. I've seen it once or twice, but not 20 or 30 times. But why Chekhov is so important, the stories and the plays, to younger readers, to older readers as well, is that he changes one. He changes one's feeling about people. There is something holy. He wouldn't like this as an atheist, but there is something holy in Chekhov's writing, and his sense of truth, combined with his compassion, is like nobody else's. Of course, Tolstoy is a greater, bigger writer, but he's not as deep a writer. He didn't get inside the soul and psyche of his characters the way Chekhov did.
And you don't speak Russian. You've not been to Russia.
I have not. I wish to be. There's a public a hint. To my bewilderment, because of reading so many Russians, also reading their letters, reading about them, as well as reading the Russian writers, Pushkin, Gogol, I worship Dead Souls as a book. Because of drinking them, you could say, reading and drinking, I have sometimes dreamt, quite often, that I am in Russia, and the locale is the steppes locale of Chekhov's story, The Steppes, which is a great, great story, and long story, so you go across a lot of country and see a lot of nature and birds and lunatics and barking dogs and so on and so on. And I am in a cart or a car, like Ireland or Russia, and I am speaking Russian. And so I waken and I think, God, I was in Russia again. I try to re-find the sentence I just said in Russian. We don't know if it was gobbledygook, but I called it Russian. And it's gone. It has evaded me. Without Russian writing, I am the world, Russian literature, I am the world would be a far poorer place.
And that's almost a perfect place for us to stop, but I must ask you one more thing. Oh. In the memoir, you do write tellingly about loneliness and about thinking about ending your own life, and fate stepping in, and an appointment being proffered at the last minute.
By my son Sasha, whom I named from a Chekhov story, The Darling. He didn't like being called Sasha, now he loves being called Sasha. Yes, I think I am a lonely person. I think probably many writers of a certain disposition are, and there have been times, especially on what I call the love trampoline, when both love and writing both fled from me or defected on me or whatever, in which I felt living unbearable, that I could not bear it anymore. But I came through it, as I have written fairly openly in my memoir. And I think as I get older, this is not said as a kind of, to soften the blows of life. I am more at home with my loneliness. Rilke said that loneliness, or being alone, which is sort of different, being alone, loneliness implies that you're longing for someone or something, a husband, a wife, a prize, a this, a that, a house, a car, blah, 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 but mostly for another person, some of the love object. But being alone is it's one step up. It's one step saner. It's more sane. And Rilke once said that it was good practice for eternity. So on that note, we will have to finish.
That was the writer Edna OBrien in conversation with me, Tim Eckott.
What seemed to be in a confidential tone of voice, what seemed to be not so much a novel as just telling, as fact. People took that very personally, and they felt that I had either mocked or, more importantly, humiliated or betrayed them. In those days, the Catholic Church in Ireland was vigilant to the point of unbelievably so. So I personally, if you like, had betrayed them, even though that was not what I thought the country.
This is the Voice of Russia from London. Hello, I'm Tim Eckott, and you're listening to In Conversation. My guest this time is the writer Edna OBrien. She's been called the doyenne of Irish literature, with around 20 novels, numerous plays, screenplays and poetry anthologies to her name. She came to prominence in 1960 with her novel The Country Girls, which was regarded as scandalous in Ireland and was both banned and publicly burned. O'Brien has now written a memoir entitled Country Girl, in which she describes her Irish childhood, her unhappy marriage to an older man, and her life in London in the swinging 60s. She said,
"My life has had on me. Only I know what I feel. A journalist, either well-intentioned or maliciously intentioned, can impose an idea. And I felt that I had been, in some quarters, regarded as, forgive the word, somewhat glamorous, and had led this Mata Hari type life, which is far from the truth.
A lot of that, a lot of that probably stems from the fact that your first novel was very much about your Irish background and your Irish upbringing, but it had what were then regarded as rather scandalous elements, and you published it when you were living in England, so you were a little bit of you'd become a bit of a traitor in a way, just in some people's eyes.
I've become definitely a bit of a rebel, shall we call it, and indeed, when I did write my first book, The Country Girls, it's almost laughable now when you think about it, Tim. It was banned, and 6 of my books were banned, in fact, and it had its little pathetic provincial or parochial burning in the chapel grounds in where I come from, a beautiful but backward place. There'd be no tradition of writing, and far more importantly, there'd be no tradition of a woman writing. So the fact that I was a woman and wrote...
Many times she'd never write a memoir, so I wondered what had prompted her to do it now.
What prompted me, I think, was age. I was in my 78th year when I began it, which is 3.5 years ago, to be precise. And it occurred to me one day, I was with my agent, that many people have written about me and have assumed a narrative of my life which is not accurate, which is not my life. And I thought, only I know not just the facts of my life, they can be researched, but only I know the impact that the narrative of